The morning of the auction, there were 17 goats nobody wanted. They stood in the back pen at the Caldwell County Livestock Yard, ribs showing through their dusty coats, ears torn from old fights with brambles, and eyes that had the dull patience of animals who had been moved too many times without being fed in between. They were a mismatched lot, the kind of leftover string a man brings to the sale when he is clearing out before bankruptcy and does not have the heart to shoot them himself. 5 were brown, 4 were white, 3 were a streaked gray, and the rest were combinations the auctioneer could not be bothered to call by name. They had been listed last on the docket because the yard man expected they would be walked back out the way they came in, and he was already thinking about how to charge the seller for the trouble. The bidders, mostly cattlemen in feed caps and dusty boots, drifted past the pen on their way to the rings where the calves were going for real money, and they laughed without meaning much by it. One of them, a heavy man named Royce Tilghman, who ran 300 head on the bottom land east of the river, leaned on the rail and shook his head and told the man beside him that those goats weren't fit for a coyote's breakfast, and that whoever bought them would be feeding them out of pity inside a week. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It had turned out to be a prediction of something else entirely. Standing a little apart from the men, near the chute where the goats had been driven in, was a young woman in a faded canvas jacket 2 sizes too large for her, with her hair pulled back under a feed cap that had belonged to someone older. Her name was Hannah Pruitt, and she was 22 years old, and she had driven down from the ridge that morning in a 9 Ford that wheezed at every stop sign, and she had $2,000 in cash folded in the inside pocket of the jacket, and she had not told anyone she was coming. She did not bid right away. She stood at the rail and looked at the goats for what the auctioneer would later describe as an uncomfortably long time, the kind of looking that made the yard man wonder if she was simple. She was not. She was counting. She was counting hooves and noting which animals favored which legs, and she was watching the way they cropped at the strands of hay on the pen floor, and she was looking at the shape of their jaws and the set of their shoulders and the depth of their chests. When the auctioneer finally got to the lot, he opened at $100 for the whole string and got no takers, and dropped to 50 and got nothing, and was about to no-sale them and send them back when Hannah raised one finger and said, plainly, 30. The auctioneer looked at her like he was not sure she understood what she was buying. She understood. She paid in cash, signed the paper, backed her trailer to the chute, and loaded the 17 goats one by one, talking to none of them and to none of the men who watched her do it. Royce Tilghman, who had not moved from the rail, said loud enough for her to hear that she had just bought herself a freezer full of disappointment, and Hannah, latching the trailer gate, said without turning around that that was one approach, and then she got in the truck and drove the 17 goats up the mountain to 140 acres of brush and briar and forgotten pasture that her grandfather had left her, and that everyone in 3 counties agreed wasn't worth the taxes. If this story is already pulling at you, do me a small favor and tap the like button, and tell me down in the comments what town or city you're watching from, because I love seeing where these stories travel. Now let's begin. Hannah had come back to the ridge the year before, in the wet spring after her mother's funeral, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that felt like it was waiting for her. She had spent 4 years in Knoxville waiting tables and taking community college classes in things she did not finish, and she had a boyfriend for a while who told her she would never amount to much if she kept going home on weekends, and she had broken up with him on a Tuesday and packed her car on a Wednesday and driven east into the mountains on a Thursday and not looked back. The place she came home to was the old Pruitt homestead, set on a long bony ridge above the Little Fork, 140 acres her grandfather Calvin had bought piece by piece during the Depression, and that nobody in the family had farmed seriously since he died in 1998. Her uncle had run a few cows on it for a decade and given up, complaining that the ground was too steep and too rocky and too overgrown with multiflora rose and autumn olive and locust saplings to make any money on. When he died, the place fell to Hannah's mother, and when her mother died, it fell to Hannah, along with a stack of unpaid property tax notices and a kitchen full of canning jars and a barn that leaned a little to the west but had been built in 1911 out of chestnut beams that would outlast anyone reading this. The only person living on the ridge when Hannah came home was her great-aunt Verna, her grandfather's younger sister, 81 years old, who lived alone in a small white house at the foot of the long drive and who had outlived 2 husbands and 1 son and who wore men's work pants and rubber boots without self-consciousness because she had earned the right. Verna had not been surprised to see Hannah pull up the gravel that April afternoon. She had set out a second cup of coffee before the truck was in sight, as if she had been told. And when Hannah came up the porch steps, Verna looked her over once and said, "You favor your grandfather around the eyes." And that was the closest thing to a welcome she gave, and it was enough. Hannah moved into the old farmhouse at the top of the ridge, slept on a mattress on the floor of what had been her grandfather's bedroom, and spent the first month just walking the land. She walked it in the rain, and in the brief warm spells, and at dusk and at dawn, and she carried a small spiral notebook in her back pocket in which she wrote down what she saw. She wrote down where the springs came out of the hillside, and where the old fence lines had been, and where the locust had taken over a south-facing slope, and where the multiflora rose had swallowed an entire pasture so completely you could not walk through it without bleeding. She wrote down the names of plants she did not know, and looked them up in a paperback field guide that had belonged to her grandfather, and that still had his pencil notes in the margins. She found in the back of a closet a stack of his record books, brown leather binders held shut with rubber bands that crumbled when she touched them, and she carried them down to the kitchen table and read them by lamplight at night, page after page of his careful handwriting in blue ink, tracking what he had planted and grazed and culled and sold across 35 years on that ridge. She read about hogs in the woods and chickens in the orchard, and a brief experiment with sheep that he had abandoned because of the dogs. And then, in a binder dated 1971, she found a long passage about goats. He had run goats on the ridge for 9 years, 60 head at the peak, and he had written about them with the kind of plain attention he gave to everything. And on one page, underlined twice, was a sentence that read, "The goats took the briar down to bare dirt in 2 seasons, and the grass came back the 3rd year without me sowing a seed." Hannah read that sentence 3 times, and then she closed the binder and went outside and stood on the porch and looked across the dark shape of the ridge. And she did not say anything, but she understood, in the way you understand a thing the moment you see it, that her grandfather had left her instructions. She did not tell anyone. She drove down to Verna's the next afternoon and sat at the kitchen table while Verna shelled beans into a tin bowl and asked questions about the goats her grandfather had run. And Verna, who never volunteered information but answered direct questions if she felt like it, said that Calvin had bought them off a man near Irwin who was getting out of the business, and that he had run them on the worst of the ground, the briar slopes nobody else would touch, and that within 3 years he had pasture where there had been thicket, and within 5 he had stopped running them because he had work for the ground that paid better, and that he had often said the goats had done the job no machine could have done at any price. Hannah asked what had happened to them, and Verna said he had sold most of them and kept a few for milk, and the milk goats had died of old age, and that was the end of it. Then Verna looked across the table at her great-niece and said, "You thinking about goats?" And Hannah said she was thinking about it. And Verna shelled beans for another minute, and then said, "The briar will eat you alive if you try to cut it. Those animals are built different. They will eat what nothing else will eat. Get the right ones." And Hannah said, "What are the right ones?" And Verna said, "The ones nobody wants. The cheap ones. The ones that have already learned to live on nothing. The ones the men at the sale barn laugh at. Those are the ones." And she went back to her beans and did not say anything else about it for the rest of the visit, and Hannah drove back up the ridge in the long blue light of evening, turning that phrase over in her mouth like a stone she had picked up out of a creek. Built different. She wrote it down in her notebook that night, and underneath it she wrote, "The ones nobody wants," and she circled both phrases and drew a line between them, and she went to bed and slept hard for the first time since she had come home. The next morning she started making calls. She called every sale barn within 100 miles and asked when the goat lots were running and which ones were the small string sales where people brought a handful of culls rather than a registered herd. She drove to 3 of those sales in April and May and bought nothing because she was learning the way the rings worked and the way the men talked and the way the prices moved, and because she did not want to spend her grandfather's money on the wrong animals. She watched a sale near Greenville where a string of 12 does went for $200 apiece because they had papers and pretty coats, and she watched the same auctioneer no-sale a string of 8 scrubby crossbreds an hour later because nobody wanted the trouble of hauling them home. She watched a man kick at a limping wether and curse it for being worthless, and she watched a teenage boy try to give away a bottle kid because the buyer wouldn't take it with the rest of the lot. She filled 3 pages of her notebook with what she saw, and she did not bid, and she drove home tired each time and lay awake thinking. By the 2nd week of June she felt ready, and she drove down to the Caldwell County yard on the morning of the sale that had the 17 goats nobody wanted, and she came home with all of them, and she unloaded them into the small holding lot behind the barn, and she stood at the rail in the falling dark and watched them sniff at the strange ground, and she did not name them. She held that line. She almost held that line. There was a small gray doe with a white blaze who limped on her left front, and who, while the others scattered, came up to the rail and looked at Hannah with an expression that was not friendly but was direct. And Hannah, before she could stop herself, said, "All right, Pilot, you can be Pilot." And after that she gave up on the rule and named them all over the next 3 days. And she wrote the names in the notebook beside short descriptions, and she felt foolish doing it and did it anyway. Verna came up the hill on the 4th morning and stood at the rail beside her and looked at the 17 goats for a long time and finally said, "Those will do," and walked back down the hill without saying anything else, and Hannah understood she had passed some kind of test she had not known she was taking. The work began the next week, and it was harder than Hannah had imagined, and she had imagined it being hard. She had to build fence, and the kind of fence that would hold goats was not the kind of fence anyone in the county had built in a generation. She drove down to the farm store in Newport and bought 4 rolls of woven wire and a pile of locust posts cut by a man up Cosby Way, and she set the posts herself with a hand auger and a 5-gallon bucket of water to soften the clay, and she stretched the wire with a come-along anchored to her grandfather's old truck, and she blistered her hands and tore her jacket and lost 11 pounds in the first 3 weeks. She started small, fencing off a half-acre patch of the worst briar on the south slope, a snarl of multiflora rose and blackberry, and locust suckers so thick a rabbit could not have walked through it. And when the fence was up, she opened the gate of the holding lot and walked the 17 goats down the hill in a loose, ragged line, and Pilot led them, limping, and they went into the briar patch and disappeared into it as if they had been waiting their whole lives for someone to let them in. Within 4 days, the outer foot of the patch was eaten down to woody stems. Within 2 weeks, she could see into the middle of it from the gate. Within a month, the briar was gone, just gone, replaced by chewed-down canes and trampled dirt, and the goats lying in the shade of the locust trunks they had stripped of bark and killed standing up. Hannah moved the fence. She had bought the wire with the moving in mind, lied enough panels she could shift herself, and she opened a new half-acre, and the goats walked into it without hesitation and started again. And the first patch sat behind them naked and brown and looking, to anyone driving by on the county road, like a piece of ground that had been bulldozed. People did drive by. The county road ran along the foot of the ridge, and from it you could see up the long south slope where Hannah was working, and word got around quickly that the Pruitt girl had bought a bunch of starving goats at the Caldwell sale and was letting them tear up her grandfather's place, and the talk at the feed store in town turned to her for a few weeks the way talk in small towns turns to anyone doing something the regulars do not understand. Royce Tillman, who had predicted the freezer full of disappointment, repeated the prediction to anyone who would listen, and added that the girl would be back at the sale barn by August trying to dump those goats for $10 a head and not getting it. A man named Earl Whitsitt, who ran the feed store and who had known Calvin Pruitt and who did not laugh as easily as the others, said only that Calvin had run goats once and had known what he was doing, and let the implication sit, and the regulars rolled their eyes and changed the subject. Hannah did not go to the feed store much that summer. She went when she needed minerals or wormer, and she paid cash, and she did not linger, and she did not answer questions beyond yes and no. And Earl, watching her load 50-pound bags into the bed of the wheezing Ford, took to slipping in an extra bag of salt now and then without saying anything about it. And she noticed and did not mention it, and the next time she came in, she brought him a jar of Verna's blackberry preserves and set it on the counter and walked out. And that was the beginning of an understanding between them that would matter later. By the end of July, the goats had cleared 3 acres of the south slope. By the end of August, they had cleared 5. Hannah had moved the fence 8 times and had repaired it twice after a black bear came through one night and tore a panel loose chasing nothing in particular. And she had lost 1 goat, a small white wether that had eaten something it should not have and died in the night, and she had buried it at the edge of the clearing and written its name in the notebook with a line through it. The other 16 were fatter than they had been in years. Their coats had come in glossy. Pilot still limped, but she led the herd with the unshakable authority of an animal who had decided she was in charge, and the rest of them followed her into each new patch of briar without complaint. September came, and the rain came with it, and Hannah, walking the cleared ground one morning with a cup of coffee, saw what her grandfather had described in the binder. Where the briar had been, where the goats had eaten everything down to the dirt and trampled the seed bed and fertilized it as they went, the first green shoots were coming up. Not weeds, grass, native grass, blue stem and orchard, grass, and a fine fescue she did not know the name of, seeds that had been waiting in the soil for decades under the smothering briar, waiting for light and disturbance and the chance to come back. She knelt down and put her hand on the ground and felt the cool damp of it and the soft prickle of new grass, and she did not cry, because she was not a crier, but she stayed there a long time with her hand on the ground, and she thought about her grandfather writing in his binder in 1971, and she thought about Verna saying, "Those will do," and when she stood up she walked the whole cleared section, all 5 acres, and she found grass coming up in every part of it, and she walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and wrote in her notebook, in capital letters, "It works." She did not tell anyone. She kept moving the fence. By the first frost, the goats had cleared 8 acres, and the first 3 were already in soft green pasture, and Hannah, walking the ridge with Verna on a cold, bright morning in late October, watched her great aunt look out across the transformed slope and shake her head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something closer to recognition. And Verna said, "Your grandfather would have liked to see this," and that was all she said. And they walked back down to the house without speaking, and Hannah understood that she had been given something more valuable than praise. The first sale came almost by accident. A woman from Asheville who raised dairy goats had heard about Hannah from a third cousin and called one evening in November asking if Hannah had any she would consider parting with. Hannah said she had 3 she could spare, including Pilot, although she did not name Pilot to the woman, and the woman drove up the next Saturday in a clean stock trailer with her teenage daughter and stood at the rail looking at the goats and said, with surprise in her voice. "These are in beautiful condition." And Hannah, who had been bracing for haggling, said yes, they are, and named a price per head that was 4 times what she had paid for the whole string of 17. And the woman did not blink, and wrote her a check, and loaded the 3 goats and drove away. And Hannah stood in the gravel holding the check and watching the trailer disappear down the county road. And she walked into the house and put the check on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time, and then put it in the drawer where her grandfather had kept his receipts. She did not spend it. She kept clearing ground. Through the winter, she fed the remaining 14 goats hay she had bought cheap from a man whose barn had partially burned, and she let them onto the cleared sections to nibble at the standing dead grass and to keep the new pasture from going to thatch, and she walked the fence line every morning with a hammer and a pocket full of staples. And she sat at the kitchen table every night with her grandfather's binders open and read his notes on what came after the clearing, the rotations he had set up, the way he had moved animals across the ground in patterns that mimicked the wild herds that had been there before any fence was built. She began to draw maps of her own, pencil sketches on the back of feed receipts, blocking out where she would move next and in what order, and the maps grew more detailed each week, until by February she had a year's plan laid out on a single large sheet of butcher paper she had taped to the kitchen wall, with the 17 acres she meant to clear by next autumn marked in pale green, and the existing cleared sections marked in darker green, and the springs marked with small blue circles, and the old fence lines marked with dashed black lines that she would not rebuild because her grandfather had written that fences should follow the land and not the surveyor. Word kept moving the way word moves in country places, which is to say slowly and then all at once. The woman from Asheville told a friend who raised meat goats outside of Knoxville, and that friend called Hannah in March and drove up to look at the herd and bought 2 more does and a young buck Hannah had been raising up from one of the original 17 and paid in cash, and asked Hannah if she would consider taking on some clearing work on a piece of timber ground the friend's family owned over near Del Rio that was choked with kudzu and that nobody could figure out what to do with. Hannah said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 days and then called the friend back and said she would do it for a fee per acre, plus the right to keep any kids born on the ground during the contract. And the friend laughed and said that was a strange arrangement, but agreed to it. And in April, Hannah hauled 12 of her goats down to Del Rio in 2 trips and set them up in a portable electric fence she had bought with the Asheville check, and within 6 weeks, the kudzu on that piece of timber ground was eaten down to the roots, and the family who owned it walked the cleared section with Hannah and stared at it the way people stare at something they had stopped believing was possible. And they paid her in cash and asked her to come back in the fall and do the next section, and they told their neighbors. By the time Hannah hauled her goats back up the ridge in early June, she had 3 more contracts lined up for the summer and a deposit on a 4th. And she had bought 11 more goats at the Caldwell sale that spring, paying a little more this time because the auctioneer had started to recognize her and because the men at the rail had stopped laughing. Although Royce Tilghman, who was always at the rail, still shook his head when she walked past and muttered something to the man beside him that Hannah pretended not to hear. She was running 36 goats now, and she had cleared 11 acres of her own ground and 22 acres of other people's, and she had paid the back taxes on the homestead and had bought a used stock trailer to replace the borrowed one and had put new tires on the Ford. And she was sleeping 6 hours a night and eating standing up at the kitchen counter, and she had never in her life been so tired or so certain. The summer of the 2nd year was the summer of the kudzu jobs, and Hannah took 6 of them, moving her growing herd from one tangled piece of southern Appalachian ruin to another. And each job ended the same way, with the landowners walking the cleared ground in something like disbelief and writing her a check and asking when she could come back. She hired a teenage boy from down the road, a quiet kid named Eli Hensley, whose father had died young and whose mother worked nights at the hospital in Newport, and she paid him fair wages to help with the fencing and the hauling. And Eli, who had been told by various adults in his life that he was not college material and not much of anything else, took to the work with the silent intensity of a kid who had finally been handed a thing he could do well, and Hannah, who recognized the look, did not say anything about it and just kept giving him more responsibility and watching him rise to meet it. By the end of August, they had cleared 63 acres between Hannah's place and the contract jobs, and the goats had multiplied, and Hannah was running 51 head, and she had begun, almost without meaning to develop a small reputation. The reputation was not for the goats themselves, although the goats were healthy and well-formed and increasingly sought after by the small farmers in the region who had figured out what Hannah was doing. The reputation was for the ground she left behind. People who had given up on pieces of their land, who had assumed that the briar and the kudzu and the autumn olive had won permanently, were finding that when Hannah's goats finished, the land underneath was not destroyed but renewed, and that within a year of the goats leaving, those pieces of ground were carrying grass and clover and the kinds of native plants that had not been seen there in a generation. A retired forester from over in Cock County drove up to Hannah's place one Sunday afternoon in September of that second year, unannounced, and asked if he could walk the ridge with her. And Hannah, who did not particularly want to walk the ridge with a stranger, but who had been raised to be polite to her elders, said yes, and the forester walked the whole south slope with her in silence, stopping now and then to kneel down and examine a patch of grass or to push aside a stand of young growth and look at the soil underneath. And at the end of the walk, he stood at the top of the ridge and looked back down the slope and said, "Young lady, you have done in 2 years what the Extension Service has been telling people is impossible for 40 years. And Hannah, who did not know what to say to that, said only, "The goats did it." And the forester smiled and said, "The goats did it because you let them, and that is not nothing." And he shook her hand and got in his truck and drove away. And Hannah stood in the gravel watching him go and then walked into the house and wrote down what he had said in her notebook, word for word, although she did not know yet why she wanted to remember it. The third spring came early and dry. There had been almost no snow over the winter, and the rains in March were thin, and the rains in April did not come at all. And by the first week of May, the ground was already cracking on the south-facing slopes, and the creek that ran along the foot of Hannah's ridge was running at half its usual depth. People in town began to talk about drought the way people in those mountains had not had to talk about it in a long time. And the old men at the feed store who had laughed at Hannah 2 years before were now talking instead about their own hay fields and how thin the first cutting was going to be, and whether they would have to buy hay out of Kentucky before the summer was over. Hannah kept moving her goats. She had 92 head now, and she had cleared most of her own south slope and had moved the herd onto the long west pasture that her grandfather had once run cattle on, and that had grown up in cedar and locust since his death, and the goats took to it the way they took to every new ground, methodically and without ceremony. And Hannah, watching them work, noticed something that had not occurred to her before. The pasture she had cleared 2 years ago, the original south slope, was still green, not lush but green and growing, while the hay fields she could see down in the valley were already browning at the edges, and the lawns in the little settlements along the creek had gone the dull tan color that meant the grass had stopped trying. She walked the cleared sections with her notebook one morning in late May and wrote down what she saw. The grass was shorter than it had been the year before, but it was alive, and the soil under it was dark and friable when she dug into it with a stick, and there were earthworms in the top 3 inches, which there had not been when she started, and the springs on the slope were still running, slow but steady, where springs on neighboring properties had already gone dry. She did not know all the reasons for it. She knew from her grandfather's notes and from the things Verna had said, and from her own watching, that the goats had something to do with it, that the way they ate and trampled and fertilized had built something in the soil that held water better than ground that had been bush-hogged or burned, and she knew that the deep roots of the native grasses that had come back were reaching down for water. That shallow-rooted lawn grass could not touch, and she knew that the patchy shade of the locust trunks the goats had killed but not removed was keeping the ground a few degrees cooler than open pasture would have been. She knew enough to understand in early June of that third year that her ridge was holding while the country around it was beginning to fail, and she knew enough to be quiet about it because she had learned by then that the wrong kind of attention was worse than no attention at all. The fire started on the 18th of June on a ridge about 12 miles southwest of Hannah's place, and the official cause was never determined, although the rumor at the feed store was that a man burning brush in violation of the burn ban had walked away from a smoldering pile for 10 minutes and come back to find the woods behind his house going up. Whatever started it, the fire moved fast, faster than anything anyone in that part of the county had seen in living memory, fed by the dry understory and pushed by a southwest wind that did not let up for 3 days. By the second day, it had jumped 2 roads and a creek and taken out 140 acres of pine plantation belonging to a paper company. And by the third day, it was burning through pasture and crossing fence lines and reaching the first of the homes along the river. And the volunteer fire departments from 3 counties were stretched across a front 6 miles wide and losing ground. Hannah heard about it on the morning of the second day from Eli, who came up the drive in his mother's car at 6 in the morning and stood on the porch and said, "You seen the smoke?" She had seen the smoke. It was a brown smear along the western horizon that had been there when she woke up, and that was visibly thicker by the time she had her coffee. She went down to Verna's that morning, and Verna was on the porch with the radio on, listening to the county emergency band, and Verna looked up at her and said, "It is going to come this way if the wind holds." And Hannah said, "I know." And Verna said, "You got water." And Hannah said, "The springs are still running." And Verna nodded and went back to listening to the radio. They evacuated the lower settlements along the river on the third day. The wind shifted slightly to the west-southwest, and the fire turned with it and began to climb the long ridge system that Hannah's place sat on the eastern end of. And by the evening of the third day, there were sheriff's deputies driving the county road below Hannah's place, telling people to be ready to leave. And by the morning of the fourth day, the smoke was so thick on the ridge that Hannah could not see Verna's house from her own porch. And she went down through the gray air with a bandana over her face and helped her great-aunt load 2 boxes of photographs and a wooden recipe box and 1 quilt into the back of the Ford. And they drove the boxes up to the homestead because the homestead was higher and Verna refused to leave the ridge entirely. And they sat together at the kitchen table while ash fell on the porch outside and listened to the radio and waited. The fire reached the western end of the ridge that afternoon. Hannah could hear it before she could see it, a low, continuous roar that did not sound like wind and did not sound like water and did not sound like anything she had a name for. And then she could see the orange glow under the brown smoke, and then she could see the flames themselves, taking the cedar and the locust on the neighboring property in great surging rushes that climbed 40 feet into the air and threw burning debris a quarter-mile ahead of the main front. The fire crews had set up a line on the county road at the foot of her ridge and were trying to hold it there. And Hannah could hear the engines and the shouting, and she stood on the porch with Verna and watched the fire come up the neighboring slope, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she was about to lose everything. And then the fire reached her fence line, and it stopped. Not all at once, and not completely, but it stopped advancing. The flames that had been climbing 40 feet through the cedar dropped to 4 feet when they hit the cleared pasture, and the wind that had been driving them forward had nothing to feed on but short green grass and bare scattered locust trunks, and the fire crawled along the ground for 50 feet into Hannah's south slope, and then it ran out of fuel, and it died. It died in patches, and then in long stretches, and then along the whole front. And the men on the county road who had been bracing for it to come over the top of the ridge and into the valley behind them watched it die and did not, for the first few minutes, understand what they were seeing. By the time the wind shifted again, late that night, The fire had been stopped along a 2-mile front by Hannah's cleared pasture and by the cleared pasture of 2 other small landowners further west who had hired Hannah's goats the previous summer, and the fire crews were able to use the cleared ground as a base from which to attack what was left of the fire on the back side of the ridge. And by the morning of the 6th day, the fire was contained, and by the end of the week, it was out. 3,000 acres had burned in the surrounding country. 11 homes had been lost. A man on the river had died trying to move his horses. The pine plantation was a black skeleton, and the bottomland pastures along the river were ash. And when the rain finally came on the 2nd day after the fire was out, it ran off the burned slopes in muddy torrents and filled the creeks with silt and killed fish for 10 miles downstream. But Hannah's ridge was green. Her south slope and her west pasture and the 2 cleared properties to the west of her were green, vivid, impossible green, in a landscape that had gone black and gray. And from the air, when the state forester flew over the area 3 days after the fire was out to assess the damage, the green ridge stood out like a hand laid flat against a piece of scorched paper. And the forester, who knew Hannah's name from the retired colleague who had walked her ridge 2 years before, circled the plain twice and took photographs and landed and made a phone call. The phone call did not reach Hannah for another week. In the meantime, the people in the county who had lost things began to drive up to her ridge on their own, not all at once but in a slow, steady trickle, parking on the county road and walking up the drive and standing at the fence line and looking at the green pasture and at the line where the fire had stopped, and some of them just looked and got back in their trucks and drove away, and some of them came to the house and knocked on the door and asked Hannah questions she did not always know how to answer. Royce Tillman came on the 4th day. He drove up the gravel in his big black truck and parked it crooked at the top of the drive and got out and stood for a long time at the rail of the holding lot looking at the goats. The same goats he had said were not fit for a coyote's breakfast 3 years before, although there were 92 of them now instead of 17, and they were fat and glossy, and they looked back at him with the calm, direct attention of animals who had nothing to apologize for. Hannah came out on the porch and stood there and did not call to him, and after a few minutes he turned and walked up to the porch and took off his cap and held it in both hands, which Hannah had never seen him do before, and he said, "I lost the bottom 40 along the river." Hannah said, "I heard." He said, "I came up here to see it for myself." Hannah said, "You have seen it." He said, "You were right, and I was wrong, and I have come to say so." He did not say it loudly, and he did not make a large production out of it, and Hannah, who had imagined this moment many times over the past 3 years, in versions that ranged from triumphant to vengeful, found that she did not feel any of the things she had imagined feeling, and instead she just nodded and said, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" He said he would, and she made him one, and they sat on the porch and drank it without saying much, and before he left he asked her, in a careful voice that she had not heard him use before, whether she would consider bringing her goats down to his bottomland in the fall to work the burned ground and help bring it back, and he would pay whatever she asked. And Hannah, looking out across the green ridge in the late afternoon light, said she would think about it, and she would let him know how it went.